Hello and welcome to Love is the Message, a podcast about music, the dance floor, sound systems and counterculture. I'm Jeremy Gilbert. I'm here as always with my friend Tim Lawrence. Hi Tim.
Hi Jem.
This is the first of our recordings of 2025. So
Hooray!
If you're listening in real time, then Happy New Year. I hope you had a good festive break. And we're going to get very festive and frolicsome today, because today our excursion through the music of 1977 is going to take us to the emergence of Eurodisco, a phenomenon which Tim is known to love. So Tim,
no, not only not especially love, but actually not know very much about. So I know I shouldn't be saying that at the top of a show on Eurodisco, but this isn't music that I'm always drawn to, but it's definitely interesting.
Well, I like Eurodisco. I think first, I like a lot of it. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. But I think let's define it as a thing. What are we defining by Eurodisco? Why does that term even exist?
I don't really know what a definition might be, but I think it primarily refers to disco that is either recorded in Europe or is recorded by European producers who might end up moving to the United States. I mean, Giorgio Moroder is clearly one of those figures, a very important figure, and and the source of some very, very let's call it very credible Eurodisco. There's no doubt about that, obviously. And then there's just what became the kind of the replication of a certain Eurodisco sound in the United States, but certain aesthetic qualities inform all of these variations of Eurodisco, however they come together. What I think becomes clear is that it's at the end of 1976, which really is the beginning of 1977 in terms of chart activity. The Eurodisco becomes a recognized phenomenon in the way that it hadn't, existed previously. Previously, it existed as a series of sort of somewhat different sounding records that happened to be coming out of, Germany, primarily, for example. But during 1977, this thing that we can recognize as Eurodisco takes shape. Now, when the Eurodisco term comes through to describe all these records, I haven't really checked, to be honest. I don't know if it even matters particularly, but it may have been in this year. It could have been in 1978. Anyway, what we're talking about in terms of, I'm trying to sort of define it a bit more in terms of its aesthetic elements. What it does rather than what it says, if you like, I suppose you could put it that way, is that it has a kind of different beat matrix, in as much as the beat, as everyone knows, basically, is simplified, and the 4 on the floor is taken higher in the mix. So the 4 on the floor is being kept with the bass drum. That becomes much higher in the mix. We hear this in, Fly Robin Fly, Silver Convention, which we've discussed probably a few years ago at this point, more or less. You can hear that again on Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby. Both of these records were 1975. And also, in addition to this kind of centralization and increasing let's say, recording levels of this 4 on the floor bass beat, there's just a lot less other percussive elements, mainly held on the drums, but also other percussion instruments that are introduced. I had the good fortune of interviewing Giorgio Moroder for Love Saves the Day, and his line was, "Well, I was living in Germany, and white German people aren't that good at dancing, and so I just decided to make a simpler beat so they could dance more easily to my records, and they would be more commercially successful." That pretty much explains it all on some level. So you could sort of say, I think it's interesting that it's not always the case that what we in the last show been calling black disco, we could call it African American disco. It's not always polyrhythmic. It's not always syncopated, but there are certainly elements of rhythmic complexity within African American disco that you don't hear in Eurodisco. Another thing that happens, another shift that takes place, is that in African American disco, which basically grew out of primarily soul music, which primarily grew out of R&B and added a bit of gospel into it and all the rest of it, and goes back to basically the rise of the blues and elements of jazz thrown in, whereas that lineage of music always had the rhythm section at its center, the bass player, the rhythm guitar, and the drummer, and that syncing in of those three musicians would basically create the groove sound of all of this music one way or another. That doesn't take place in Eurodisco. Instead, you get more emphasis on a kind of a melodic line, more emphasis on orchestration.
Yeah, and I'd say generically, it often draws on pop, on rock, on sort of very mainstream rock sounds, and it draws on pop in particularly to the extent that pop itself, like pop, by the mid-70s, still, especially in Europe, often means, it doesn't mean what we think of pop meaning after the early 80s, really, which is basically sort of electronic soul. But it means more is, music which is still drawing on some elements and tonalities from sort of show tunes or kind of even light classical music, as it was called. So lots of strings, for example. So all those elements are also coming into it. I mean, in my mind, it's one of the things we're going to talk about, isn't it? In my mind, one of the things that makes it Euro is in fact the extent to which it often seems to be drawing on that Northern European sort of orchestral tradition.
Absolutely. We're going to sort of think about this a little bit more right now, probably, because, on the one hand, Giorgio Moroder with Donna Summer, but that was happening all over. They sort of recorded these albums that they thought of, I think reasonably, let's say, as concept albums.
Yeah.
And that was somehow, so with Donna Summer, we're not going to hear it this show, but we'll definitely bring it in next show. We're going to play I Feel Love by Donna Summer, one of the greatest, most influential records ever recorded. Obviously, this is in some respects, we can call this Eurodisco. Doesn't sound that Eurodisco in some respects, but in other respects it does. I Feel Love comes at the end of an album. I forget the name of the album. I could look it up. I'm not going to interrupt our flow here, which is tracks that are inspired by different moments in time. So there was some sort of big band 30s number and all the rest of it. And then Giorgio Moroder decided he wanted to end with something more futuristic, and that was I Feel Love. So there's a sort of concept that runs, and I think that's kind of this idea of there being a concept links into sort of this history that, on some level goes back to the European Enlightenment and colonial project that wants to develop and contain, register, and organize all knowledge, including, knowledge that extends beyond Europe, obviously. And it was partly within this long historical period that we have the emergence of orchestral music, the symphony orchestra, the symphonies of all these composers, culminating with Beethoven and the thematics, which are partly the thematics of European nationalism becoming this transformative force. And peaking in the 19th century primarily. These thematics are supposedly being picked up by Eurodisco. The orchestration is partly kind of about the sound of the music, but there's also what are seen to be these themes. Now, how well do these themes work within kind of dance music, or to what extent are they bombastic and pretentious? Progressive rock made a similar move. It turned something that was about dancing and, you would feel basically, and music that might make you want to dance. It would try to turn into something that more sophisticated. And I don't think we're arguing that makes the music necessarily bad, but it's definitely different and it can become pretentious.
What's interesting about that, though, I was just thinking that, of course, what progressive rock takes, the 3-4 minute rock song and extends it, and is very, very self-consciously doing that in line with a particular aesthetic ideology, which comes from, indeed, the Enlightenment and classical music and romantic orchestral music, which basically says the longer you can sit and listen patiently to a very long piece of music, like the better a kind of person you are. And prog rock partly does this. It partly does this out of an affinity with acid rock and in coming out of a listening context in which people want to be able to just sit and listen to bits of music while they're tripping like they've been listening to certain kind of jazz and Indian music in the 60s for that purpose. But it is also heavily influenced by, indeed, just this sort of classical music, this orchestral music ideology of, that you're really a better person if you can just sit and listen for a long time than someone who just wants 3-minute bursts of excitement and wants to dance. But then with disco, there's something sort of different but going on, because disco also extends tracks. Disco also extends like the 3-4 minute soul tracks on which it's been based. In a way, James Brown has already started to do with funk. He's started to get these extended tracks, but of course the purpose there is so that you can dance, so you can really kind of lose yourself in the dance. But then you end up with this quite interesting space, in between, like the prog rock, the sort of prog rock, rock symphony, and this idea of the disco, the 12-inch, 15-minute disco mix as a sort of mini symphony as well, and in which there's an interesting sort of slippage between different reasons why you want your tracks to be longer than 3 minutes now.
Yeah. Well, let's bring in a bit of music, just because we've already been talking for a little while, and to try and shake up the discussion a little bit, I thought we would listen to the SalSoul Orchestra's Magic Bird of Fire, open brackets, Firebird Suite, close brackets, which was released in 1977, this year that we are still, immersed in. But I do want to reference that it's in 1978 that Walter Gibbons remixes this record. I appreciate that Matt is only going to play 30 seconds, and it may be that 30 seconds might not be distinguishable between the two versions of the record, but just so that at least for listeners know that there is a particularly epic extended Walter Gibbons mix that comes out that year. So let's have a listen to SalSoul Orchestra, Magic Bird of Fire. One of the reasons I wanted to bring in this record is to highlight the very simple fact that although we often identify Eurodisco as being kind of shaped by influenced and shaped by orchestral music, there's been huge amounts of orchestration used in, for, let's call it, African American music already, long before Eurodisco comes about. Motown regularly turned to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra string section on, many of its recordings. Philadelphia International, which opened in 1971 by Gamble and Huff, regularly introduced the Philadelphia Orchestra string section into its recordings. And when the Carey brothers founded SalSoul Records in 1975, their first, or was it second, record was the SalSoul Orchestra, which was basically the Philadelphia Orchestra, being rebranded by a New York label. And so the SalSoul Orchestra record we've just listened to, 2 years later, the SalSoul Orchestra are still, recording this music, and it's orchestral. In this particular instance, Firebird Suite references Stravinsky's Firebird Suite.
I mean, one thing I think about quite often these days is the way in which, particularly in the sort of post-war period in the United States, during the sort of high period of Fordism, during that period of the sort of massive expansion of the consumer economy, but also very kind of rapid social mobility for quite a lot of people, classical music really takes on this kind of social and cultural status, really more than it has in Europe. I don't know about the German-speaking world, but even more than in places like France and Britain. It takes on this status, this aspirational status. Like if you want your child to grow up to be a cultured and cultivated person, like between sort of the 40s and the 70s, what do? You buy them these box sets of records in which Leonard Bernstein introduces the orchestra to young people, and you sit them down and they listen to all these little bits of music, and then they listen to the Peter and the Wolf and things like this sort of orchestral music for children, and they're supposed to be being sort of enculturated into this, socialized into this whole tradition. And you've also got Fantasia, the Walt Disney film coming out in the 50s, which is sort of, rightly now thought of as a sort of psychedelic classic. But really, the purpose of Fantasia was to culturally legitimate the practice of cinematic animation by linking it to the most high status of high culture, as people thought of it in America at that time, and that was European classical music. And Stravinsky in particular has this real status. Stravinsky has this status at that moment in time as being supposedly the sort of culmination of that tradition. Like if you have been taught, if you as a little kid you've listened to your Leonard Bernstein recordings, and then you've listened to like Vivaldi and Mozart, which is quite kind of easy listening, and then you've kind of grown into listening to the great masters like Beethoven and Brahms, then if you're really a sophisticate, then finally you can get to Stravinsky. Of course, like Schoenberg and stuff like that is only for the real, the sort of full-time intellectuals and the possibly dangerous communist elements. But the I mean, that's why. But
probably not that dangerous.
Not very dangerous. It's not a lot of fun. It's not a lot of fun. But Schoenberg. But yeah, it's true. But so that is really, I think that is an interesting context because Walter Gibbons, obviously, he's completely that generation. He's a generation who absolutely would have been taught growing up this particular way of thinking about the history of music, in which Stravinsky has this very, very specific status. So the fact that he turns it into, or they with him sort of turn it into this.
Well, it's more Vince Montana is the key figure, probably. I mean, Walter does the remix, but the record is released and Vince Montana indeed is the orchestra lead. He's he's a very skilled vibraphone player and an orchestral leader. So it's probably that way around, but I take your point.
Yeah, so it was interesting. Interesting to think about that context.
Yeah. So when we think about white US culture, it is obviously European culture in many respects. I mean, it takes on its own life slowly and gradually, that becomes distinctive from Europe, but its roots are clearly. It's a white colonial society that has more or less managed to exterminate most of the indigenous people, which could bring us back to its support for Israel. But we're going to not get involved in that today, I believe. So that's so let's keep things light and have more fun and create more awkwardness and embarrassment, because the next record I'm going to propose, we ask Matt to slip in 30 seconds of, if we want to listen to it for that long, but I think we should, is the Walter Murphy Band's A Fifth of Beethoven. Is this one of your favourites?
Well, I do sort of like it. I mean, I think of it again as, continuing the story I was telling really about the particular status of classical music. I think of this in the same category as things like Hooked on Classics.
Sure, yeah.
And these sort of American novelty records, which were partly based on this idea of kind of condensing and simplifying the sort of musical power of the 19th century orchestra and doing something slightly new with it, but we're also sort of justifying themselves on the basis that they were popularizing the classics. So I find it sort of charming now. Actually, I find it sort of charming, even though it's not. I can't really imagine voluntarily sticking it on the turntable, like at home or in public.
It's kind of like ideology, isn't it? Really, I was quite into the kind of Hooked on Classics. Well, I remember buying loads of the records. I guess that's what it was called. The ideological kind of idea thing behind it is that somehow this is more, orchestral music is more sophisticated, it's more intelligent, it's more developed. All of the mums and dads, or mums and dads, or however kind of families and kids and families are configured. The idea that if you there's that Mozart series, isn't there? And if you play that Mozart series to your 2-day-old child, they are supposed to develop a higher IQ or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I was just framing it. But I'm thinking about it now, thinking about how that record sounds. Maybe we're being a bit unfair, because the other way of hearing this record in particular, this Fifth of Beethoven, is, well, it only takes like a couple of hooks really from Beethoven's Fifth, and it pulls out some elements from it, which are, they are all time, seminal hooks. Everybody knows that.
So are you saying this is a good thing then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it is sort of appropriating it, for the disco dance floor, and I think it works fairly well as a. I think it works fairly well as a sort of SalSoul.
Well, this isn't SalSoul, is it? It's not a Sal. It doesn't matter. I'm not saying it's not bad.
No, but it's SalSoul derived, isn't it? It's heavily derived. It's clearly sort of derived from the sound of the SalSoul.
That's interesting. You might be right. You might be right. We don't need to suggest any sort of hierarchies between any of these different ways of writing music, because there's no point to that really. But I could sort of see the role that, let's say, Hooks on Classics might play, that you do a full orchestral arrangement around a pop song. And look, there's been loads of this stuff goes on at the South Bank Centre and that kind of thing, where, orchestral musicians get together with some electronic producer and they take it all very seriously, and they get tens of thousands of pounds to kind of put on a performance. And it's trying to, bring different musical cultures and, even people from different cultural backgrounds, including racial, etc. backgrounds together. So this is going on. It's a sign of the times. I can see why people find this engaging. And the point about the Walter Murphy Band, Fifth of Beethoven, it's obviously catchy. It can't not be catchy, but it was one of these elements that eventually fed into the idea that disco is ridiculous.
Yeah, that's true.
It thinks that it can, apart from anything else, it can appropriate anything, and then when it appropriates it, it puts it in a box and it reduces it.
Yeah, that's true. That's the idea of disco. Disco becomes this territorializing machine, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Hooked on Classics is not that album you were talking about. There was arrangements of pop songs. Hooked on Classics is like pop arrangements, like sped up arrangements of little bits of classical music.
Okay.
But there were also those records you were talking about that were classical arrangements of pop songs, and it was all kind of put into the same category. But the whole Hooked on Classics thing I think is partly inspired by this particular record by Fifth of Beethoven. It is like they've done that. They do that treatment to like loads of different bits of the classical repertoire.
I mean, at least with the Magic Bird of Fire, we have what's kind of really, there's something more musically interesting going on, I think, and especially with the Walter Gibbon mix, it's a really interesting way of the way the percussion comes in and out, and at a point we have proper serious percussion breaks, and which is typical of Walter, of course. That's kind of quite compelling. But the Walter Murphy Band is, I think it's kind of quite good fun, probably for. On a sort of gimp. I mean, this is also true of a lot of 70s music. It might be worth saying. I don't think it's anywhere near as true today. But in the 70s, it seemed like it was like the way to get a pop hit was to, at least especially in the UK, I suppose, maybe, was to do like a novelty song.
Yeah.
I mean, it's when the Muppets song wasn't there the Muppets, but there was like loads of these things, weren't there, in the 70s?
Yeah, the novelty records were a big thing.
Whereas they're not really today. I mean, I suppose it is a cultural loss, we could say. No, but seriously, because, today the charts are so homogeneous, aren't they, in their sound? Whereas at least you could have anything from a punk song to a novelty song. No,
but also there's nothing funny in the charts. I mean, there's one thing that's really striking today about sort of the kind of music that is popular. It's really not very funny. There isn't a lot of humor. There's not a lot of humor in contemporary hip hop. There's not a lot of humor. It takes it very seriously. There's not a lot of humor in sort of pop music. I guess actually maybe sort of hyper pop is often very tongue in cheek. So maybe that's a bit unfair.
if we're talking about Eurodisco, and if we are all agreed, as we should be, that disco originated basically in New York City, and certainly the United States, then Eurodisco is a European appropriation of an idea that took root in the United States. Now, look, obviously, the United States has, devoured European culture, especially white United States. Has devoured European culture from the beginnings of the nation and its constitution. What we have here, on some level, is a switch around. It's Europe co-opting from the United States, rather than doing what would go on to be much more standardized, especially probably from, well, I'm sure from the 1970s onwards, no doubt, but it accelerates. And is part of the reach of the American empire through neoliberal capitalism, so increasingly over the last 40 years, let's say, if that's roughly accurate, we could say that it's European corporate culture has done its best to double up as global culture. What we have here is actually Europe co-opting something that took root loosely in the United States, and turning it into something that's kind of actually European. Now, this is probably, we could probably do a whole series on this, or at least a mini series, but this at the very least takes us back to kind of what happened with rock and roll, primarily through the Beatles, and then could be said to have also happened with rock music, where, with the Stones obviously also playing a prominent role alongside the Beatles. But that's when, basically UK here, culture in particular, popularizes US culture, and in particular popularizes US black culture. So rock and roll has is almost the line goes that there was a British invasion of the United States in 1966, kind of led by the Beatles, and effectively the Beatles were selling back to the Americans what they had themselves created. But instead of it being, in some cases, black musicians recording rock and roll, here is the Beatles selling back to the Americans rock and roll. I mean, part of this is the way that somehow or other, but this is it could be a big discussion in itself. The UK in particular has been pretty good at developing, for want of a much better term, subcultural trends, or picking up on a cultural development and turning it into something that it is able to articulate and market and develop. And part of the reason for this seems to be that the UK is a much smaller, obviously, country than the United States. For various reasons, its radio stations have historic and charts and completely have been less segmented. So it seems there's a greater mobility within UK popular culture. And this carries on through beyond the historical moment that we're looking at here. But I think we can at least begin to understand Eurodisco, at least as part of, it's not necessarily a UK thing, because actually probably France and Germany are ahead of the UK when it comes to recording Eurodisco. But something is going on here anyway, where in this particular instance, Europe is actually co-opting something that develops in the United States. And often that thing looks and sounds black in many regards, and then resells it. And not only does that, but does it with greater capitalist prowess. It makes more money. Eurodisco barely, doesn't really exist as a mass phenomenon during 1975 or even 1976. But in 1977, all of a sudden, Eurodisco starts to kind of become the best-selling form of disco. And then within this, and I think let's just say that for now we're going to kind of return to this theme rather than try and explore it now, because we want to get onto some more music apart from anything else. But there's ongoing thing, but like, okay, what then happens in this process when Eurodisco producers take disco and turn it into something that sounds like Eurodisco? What is involved in this process? And how does the non-white elements of disco, how do they get reframed in this process of Eurodisco kind of recording this music, and how does blackness, for example, get to be figured? But we'll return to this as we progress. Let's listen to some more music. Let's hear the Kongas, spelt with a K, a record called Jungle. released in 1974 on Barclay Records.
In the jungle of my mind, tongues and lips of a pies, Jen works in the bar, she won't make a sign. In the jungle of my mind, king comes slowly to sleep, a KKK man who's got to break down.
Just to introduce it briefly, the reason we're listening to this record in particular, I mean, it could be several actually, is that this record featured a drummer as well as a composer called Mark Cerrone. And Cerrone is spelled Cerrone. And it's Cerrone who, in late 1976, will go on to become the breakthrough Eurodisco composer. And that's why we want to spend a little bit of time with Cerrone. It's really remarkable to me to think that, after Giorgio Moroder has his breakthrough with Donna Summer, after Silver Convention really kind of established probably more of an original Eurodisco sound with Fly Robin Fly than Moroder does with Love to Love You Baby, that the next figure to come into this scene actually started out in this band, which is combining funk, progressive rock, disco, and African music. And I also, I'm sure I remember you playing a record by the Kongas.
It's not the Kongas, it's just Kongas. But yeah, I played the Andikana O. It was a classic.
Yeah, exactly. I remember you playing that. So that was why I didn't know if you'd heard this jungle record, but I was fun anyway. I thought it was yeah.
No, I hadn't. No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I know the album. I only know the later sort of albums. So yeah, and I had never clocked actually that Cerrone was in the band. So
yeah,
that is super interesting. Yeah, because it is. I mean, it's closer to someone like War, isn't it? It's more this sort of mixture of
Osibisa, all these, there's, and we've done this a while ago. There's all these, bands often feature African musicians who happen to be living in Europe that David kind of just, draws on in these, these opening few years at the Loft. That the soul. I mean, it's a different lineage, but Manu Dibango, Sol Makosa comes in. There's all these sounds that have a raw, organic feel that also has a prominent African element.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's interesting and sort of surprising that it's coming out of the what we're going to call Eurodisco is going to partly come out of this space. Although I guess there's a sort of parallel in Kraftwerk developing their super minimal electronic pop, like out of the kind of mid-year of basically German acid rock. So there's arguably there's various people on that sort of trajectory around this time.
Yeah, I think it's also just that it was an open moment musically. I mean, in Europe, you had different forms of kind of. I mean, it was a moment when rock music was clearly very prominent, if not hegemonic, and there was a lot of pop music. So there wasn't really for someone like Cerrone or what have you, the reference point was all this interesting mix of music that could be made to cohere, but included rock and included kind of proto disco and included some soul and some funk and some records that were coming out of Africa, and so there was this mix, and a lot of these records in the early 70s, because it was a time of early convergence, were coming together. So it's very interesting that this would be recorded presumably in France. It was France. But then if you think about it, I mean, France had Paris had a large, African community, and and Manu Dibango was recording a lot of his music in Paris, and all sorts of African musicians were recording music there. So it's really, maybe someone needs to write a history of this period in Parisian music history at some point, but I thought that was a kind of interesting. Anyway, so this is Cerrone. We could say more about the Kongas and Cerrone even, but I think it's probably time to move on. One other thing I think it is useful just to kind of mention as we in relationship to the Kongas or the Kongas is that Don Ray was also part of that lineup, and he would go on to become, an influential orchestral arranger on a whole number of Eurodisco records, and just if there are any David Mancuso fans out there, David really loved Don Ray's Standing in the Rain. So that was a Eurodisco record that David would play.
Don Ray, real name Raymond Donez. And he was another French producer and performer.
Yeah. So Cerrone's kind of breakthrough record as a solo artist is Love in C minor. And that was released in late 1976 on a French label called Maligator. So it's like alligator, but with an M at the front.
Yeah. It's mal. It's bad.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And interestingly, I apologize because I feel like I've already used up my David quota in this episode already, but you're gonna have to bear with me a bit here because there is a really interesting David connection to this. The first person in the United States, it seems clear, because of David's position in the record pool, apart from anything else, as well as having the party that is considered to be the most desirable to have a record played and all the rest of it. The first person to kind of go public on this record was David in a Disco Files column published by Vince Aletti, I think 3 weeks before it was a final Disco Files column at the end of 1976. And Vince would ask for DJs to submit the records that they were most into playing at any particular moment. And well, it was interesting, actually, when Vince asked David, I would have thought that maybe David wouldn't cooperate because he generally avoided any sort of publicity or media profile. But also David liked to collaborate with people. He liked to support people. Vince was still a relatively new writer. Disco was, anyway, all sorts of reasons. They were sort of friends. David wanted to support Vince. And in the list that David submitted to Vince for this final column of 1976, he included this record by Cerrone, Love in C minor. So that's his first kind of appearance in the sort of US, media, if you like. David had been playing it, and it was a record he had heard through the record pool. Vince reports on this record. He says, I first heard, I will listen to it in just a moment, a little bit of it anyway. I first heard Cerrone's Love in C minor at David Mancuso's loft in New York, where it caused an immediate sensation and has become the hottest record in the club. Vince adds, import copies are still extremely rare. Most importers are unfamiliar with both the label and the artist, but Cotillon Records, alerted by contacts in France, has already picked up the album for American release, scheduled February the 2nd, if not sooner, etc. Vince concludes, this is the hot one right now, just what we need to heat up those cold winter nights. Okay, well, let's definitely have a little bit of a listen to 30 seconds of Love in C minor by Cerrone. This is a record that lasts 16 minutes. This is one of the sort of most notable qualities of this record. So it uses time in a way that, where are we? We're now at the end of 1976. So, the 12-inch single, the commercial 12-inch single has been in circulation for, I don't know if it's 6 months, but a period. And obviously the 12-inch single enables records to become longer, remixes. Cerrone is entering into that. But 15 minutes or 16 minutes is still a kind of a notably kind of long recording. I think what we can hear pretty explicitly is there's this kind of foregrounding of a really tough 4-on-the-floor beat, in a way that, possibly hasn't been heard in even other Eurodisco records to a certain extent. It's very propulsive. It's also less soulful and probably less feel-oriented in its rhythm section, which I've already kind of talked about as being a characteristic of Eurodisco. There is a really interesting David story here again, and that interesting David story is that he told me the record company asked me to listen to Love in C minor They basically wanted David to go and listen to this record and give his feedback. And according to his feedback, basically potentially change the recording in who knows what ways. I mean, it's not something that David had done previously. I don't believe it's something he did again. But it's a kind of very interesting moment, I think.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
Yeah, and David, I mean, just because David's response to these situations, or most situations, just is interesting. Usually, he thinks things through it, you know, in terms of politics, basically. David, as he recounted to me, he said, "Okay, 3 things. 1, you cannot offer me any money for my opinion, because he says I wouldn't want to associate money with music." He said, 2, I can sit there and listen and do not have to say anything. So he didn't want to be required to give feedback. And 3, if I'm going to respond verbally or by writing, I have that option. So David said he listened to the record and he said, leave it alone. And he asked if he could have a 1 generation half-track copy of the master, and they gave this to him. So this is why David was kind of the first person to be playing it, basically. And David told me it was a good production. I played it a lot. I would never have guessed this. I like the record very much. And then he said, although I wouldn't say that I loved it. He said it was very nice and clean, very middle of the road. This is where it gets kind of more punchy, if you like, very fake, very commercial. During that time, they were making longer records. People liked it more than I did. It's not something that had a lot of emotion in it. I think it's a pretty good analysis, actually. What do you think of it all?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. My feeling about the track isn't really any different from David's. It's really interesting. It's really important. It's one of those records that's been reissued loads of times. It's often cited as a classic. It probably appears on as many disco compilations as any other record, I think. It's always left me a bit cold, I have to say. I've sort of tried to love it and not really loved it. So
yes, it doesn't necessarily need to be like 16 minutes long. But no, I mean, it's clearly like, it's also like it's a breakthrough record within a sort of genre. I kind of, in many ways, it goes well. I mean, Love to Love You Baby was probably 16 minutes, wasn't it? I mean, the thing about Love to Love You Baby is it's. I mean, I actually really I have some issues with Love to Love You Baby. Generally, I find it a bit embarrassing when women, you know, fake an orgasm on a record.
Yeah,
I don't really feel that comfortable dancing to that. There were loads of house records, you know, in the early 1990s that would have that kind of that female groaning sound, etc. And it just felt like it was all at the whim of a male producer, basically. And so we actually have this again in different way, obviously on this record as well. I think it's worth pointing to this. I mean, whereas with Donna Summer, you know, George Moroder put Donna Summer in a darkened studio and, you know, asked her to, you know, do what she did. And she did so in sort of some privacy, but there was also the sense that it was, you know, autoerotic. You know, she was generating her own pleasure. It wasn't like, didn't revolve around a guy being in the room necessarily, or her desire for a guy. So there was something politically interesting about that, at least. I mean, here we have 3. I mean, one of the things, it should be said, the cover features a sort of semi-naked woman on the front, and then inside on the back, I think there's 3 women who are a bit more, including, I think it's the woman on the front, I can't remember, but they're a bit more clothed, but it's all erotic, and they're all they're sort of draping themselves around Cerrone. And towards, I think it's the beginning of Love in C minor, the 3 women are talking about cruising and sharing a man, and that man, of course, turns out to be Cerrone, and the fantasy is also clearly his own. So it's quite problematic in a sense. It's kind of soft porn, basically, on a disco record in a sense. Money ain't all he's got. Look at the front of him. That ain't no banana. I mean, it's genuinely embarrassing. I mean, maybe we could sort of say it's. I don't think it's intended. I suppose it's partly intended to be humorous, but it's just not very funny, really. For me.
No, but it's also. I mean, it was taken up as a sort of gay record as well, quite early on. I mean, it's one that I've always associated with gay discos.
Absolutely, and it's a good point, and it wasn't one that I'd actually just realised I should need to be bringing in specifically. But yeah, Eurodisco, you're right to point this. It really does take off in the white gay discotheques, in particular the private ones of New York City. Flamingo opened in 1974, 12 West, which was a little bit more multicultural, although it was a bit more notable for being a bit more cross-class than cross-race in terms of gay dance culture. But yeah, these are the places where Eurodisco starts to fly. And Studio 54 on Thursdays and Sundays is basically our gay nights. So Eurodisco works very well at Studio 54, where the music is supposed to be smooth. And it's the constituency of white gay men and some promoters, including Ray Caviano, who was working for TK Records at the time, but would go on to work for Warner's, the first openly gay executive to be appointed in that kind of role. There's a lot of kind of, of support for Eurodisco by people who are influential within the music and wider music scene and industry. These white gay venues that are influential within the wider scene and do draw heavily on Eurodisco. They do also play African American disco during this period. And, Richie Rivera, who's a Puerto Rican DJ who loves percussive sounds, is a DJ at Flamingo. So during this period, I want to emphasize there's a lot of openness as well. But certainly Eurodisco takes off in these places. So that's a good point to have made. Love in C Minor was co-written by a person called Alec Konstantinos. And from what I can understand, it seems quite likely that Konstantinos also had a production role or influence on the record as well. On the back cover of Love in C Minor, Cerrone writes, "Thank you, Don Ray and R. Konstantinos, for your talent and artistry." So Konstantinos becomes another major figure in Eurodisco. So I think we'll kind of talk about Konstantinos's entry into the Eurodisco scene, if you like, as the last segment of this episode. Alec Konstantinos is an Egyptian-born Armenian. He had lived in Australia at the time. He was residing in France, but he also recorded his music in England. So there's something very disco about this. There's a mobility, there's a cosmopolitanism, there's a bringing together of discrete elements. When I first started to hear house music, it was very clear to me. It's like, you can bring anything into house music. Any sound can be slipped into that. It seemed at the time, at least. Basically, disco works in the same way. It's a matrix. It's a structure which you can kind of incorporate almost anything, including Beethoven. So Konstantinos' background seems to kind of also fit well into, someone coming and living in many different countries and exuding or articulating different cultures. He had actually Konstantinos had worked with Demis Roussos, who's this Greek singer, also born in Egypt, as it happens. So there we go. I think this might be the first time we've talked about Demis Roussos on the show. And Konstantinos, I did interview him for Love Saves the Day, and he recounted that Cerrone was working in a record store. He knew that disco was selling, and that basically Konstantinos agreed to work on Love in C Minor with him. Konstantinos had got very into this new dance sounds when it first emerged. And when he also realized that Cerrone basically couldn't sing but wanted to record a record, basically Konstantinos suggested they sacrifice the vocals, because there aren't really vocals on Love in C Minor, in the quest for a driving rhythm. And Konstantinos had been influenced by listening to things like Living in a Glass House, Temptations track, also Love to Love You Baby. He just really loved the music. And decided, that it made him want to record music, day and night, as he said. So he says that this is what he put in Love in C Minor, which gives him although he's not featured he's not credited as a producer. It sounds like he did have did help shape the aesthetic of the record. Whereas, let's say, Love to Love You Baby had run at about 100 beats per minute. And from what I can remember, Fly Robin Fly has also got a slightly slowy kind of feel. It doesn't feel like, my memory is it doesn't run at even 120 beats a minute. I don't know. But Love in C minor anyway runs at 128 beats a minute. This is another thing that Europe actually does, is it speeds up the music. Partly because, if you speed up the music, I guess you allow room for sort of less expression. I mean, this is what vocalists would also complain about with disco in general. Never mind Eurodisco. If a record is going really fast, it limits the room for kind of, let's say, vocal expression. And I think it's the same with dance. Probably it's the same with instrumentation. So Eurodisco makes this move. It starts to, it goes, quite a bit faster than any of the disco that's been released so far. As Konstantinos told me, and I quote, "We had a different purpose than Philadelphia. Philadelphia recorded songs with beautiful arrangements and fabulous singers, whereas we recorded songs that were going onto the dance floor. We were disco-oriented and raw." That's Alec Konstantinos's introduction into the Eurodisco scene, if you like. He plays this role in Love in C minor, and following his collaboration with Cerrone is to actually get involved in Casablanca Records, and it's virtually a requirement on any episode or anything that talks about Eurodisco to reference Casablanca Records. Casablanca Records would go on to become would soon emerge as the best-selling label for disco in the United States, which makes it quite remarkable in a sense, because it was an independent record label, although eventually majors would buy into it. And the story does need to be told, and it can be told reasonably quickly. So Casablanca Records was created by an entrepreneur called Neil Bogart. He was born Bogatz, but then changed his name. He worked as a promoter at MGM and then as a general manager at Buddha. And in 1973, Neil Bogart approached Warner Brothers and to propose that Warner's bankroll and distribute a new Los Angeles label that would be titled after the movie Casablanca. Because, of course, Neil Bogart related to the name of Humphrey Bogart. That was where the idea came from for Casablanca Records. Warner's agreed, but Bogart's first releases weren't very notable. They didn't do particularly well. Warner's then refused to promote Neil Bogart's first major signing, which was the rock band Kiss, who I think we've spoken about on previously. And after a year, Bogart asked Warner's to release Casablanca from its distribution deal, and Warner Brothers agreed. And at this point, it meant that Casablanca was independent. So Bogart then had this, which we've discussed already a little while ago, that Bogart's first breakthrough record followed when he was introduced to Love You Baby. It had already been recorded. He didn't have to do anything to it specifically. And Tom Moulton, who was observing these developments, told me Neil hated disco before he got to Casablanca. I remember him saying the disco was going nowhere, but boy, did he start to sing a different tune after Donna Summer. Instant turnaround. So Neil Bogart was wanting to develop more disco releases, and he invited a band that was named the Casablanca's Heart and Soul Orchestra, which featured Frankie Crocker and the legendary black WBLS DJ, previously this lineup was known as Frankie Crocker's Heart and Soul Orchestra. But then he signed to basically, very improbably, I think, to Casablanca, and his lineup became known as Casablanca's Heart and Soul Orchestra. And they covered, we're finally getting to the point here, they covered Love in C minor, Cerrone's record, which Konstantinos had his name on because he was a songwriter, a co-writer. They covered Love in C minor without permission. so clearly Casablanca had skipped a few legal requirements here. Konstantinos called them from Paris, basically made it clear that they were going to face legal action if they did something. And Neil Bogart said, "Come over and let's talk." And so at this point, Neil Bogart signed Alec Konstantinos as one of his producers. This is the way, partly, in which I'm not trying to tell I'm not trying to give any view of this really, but what we're seeing here is a label that wasn't really established as a disco label particularly, then gets a hit through Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder and continues to kind of work with Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder, then does a kind of bit of a dodgy cover of a Cerrone record with of all people, Frankie Crocker, it seems a bit improbable. But they're covering the Cerrone record, and then through that, Konstantinos is signed up to Casablanca. All of a sudden, we have a West Coast independent label becoming a center for Eurodisco. And because the market, or a huge market, is in the United States. So basically, it was at this point that Neil Bogart signed the rights to Konstantinos' latest, recording post Cerrone and the breakthrough of that record. And the record is recorded by an artist that is called Love and Kisses. The album is Love and Kisses, and it features 2 songs. And on the second side is a record that we are about to listen to called I Found Love, open brackets, Now That I Found You, close brackets.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting record because the thing I really noticed about it, obviously it has this very driving rhythm, almost a bit rocky, but it's these string stabs that I really associate with sort of early high energy, or with the sort of transition between Eurodisco and high energy. It reminds me of other records, not necessarily from Europe, like the Debbie Jacobs records from a bit later, for example. And it's this almost kind of manic use of the strings to produce this effect that it's kind of interesting because it's sort of weird, and it's an effect that probably works better if you're doing it with electronics, like this extremely repetitive, very high in the frequency range, kind of very exciting sort of sound, but it's really sort of pushing what you can do with strings a bit. I think it works when you do it with electronics. You can actually get a slightly warmer effect doing the same thing. So slightly kind of manic sound, but it's interesting for all that. It's interesting because of the way it's going to sonically feed into the development of, as you've been saying, of things like house music. In certain strands of house, even techno, you can even hear, in sort of trance from the 90s onwards, you can hear some of the DNA of all those things here in quite an interesting way. It's a sort of record I sort of like. I very rarely play it if DJing. I sort of because it's one of those. It's a sort of record that, in a way, it's sort of better for driving. This sort of sound to me, but it can actually end up sounding quite harsh on a big sound system. But it's still very interesting.
I think it's what we hear is the grounding of a Eurodisco sound. And it gets to be properly defined on some level, I think, by Cerrone. That's the point where Eurodisco really starts to sound like Eurodisco. It becomes recognizable with a certain driving aesthetic, sort of classical elements intertwined. It's not really a record that I'm particularly drawn to, but it was a big release for Casablanca. It was actually recorded in London in 1977. I think it's worth mentioning, or important to mention, that the album cover is quite problematic. It features a woman, a model, where you don't really, all you see is her sort of more or less her upper body. You don't see her face or her legs. And she's wearing a ripped T-shirt. It's been ripped in several places. And there are 6 male hands on her body. it's not straightforwardly a rape scene, but it's a scene of kind of radical molestation, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that, and I'm not trying to point the blame finger at anyone here in particular. We don't know who came up with this idea, for example. I certainly don't know that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's Konstantinos who came up with this idea, for example. But it does there is something here around, given that the way that the women feature in the Cerrone record as well, there is a sense of, male produce, at least within a male production realm, and men are, obviously dominant within the studio. And here we don't generally have proper female vocals either. That there's it's some of these records go hand in hand with a blatant sexual objectification of women.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it is very icky, that cover.
So that's a kind of a slightly odd, it's not a specifically musical note to end on, but I think we can just conclude by reiterating the what has happened at this point is that whereas this record, all these records we've spoken about so far, most of them, although I guess certainly not the SalSoul Orchestra record and not the Walter Murphy Band either, but generally speaking, records that sound like Eurodisco have been recorded in Europe. And even Love and Kisses was recorded in London. But we are at the point where Giorgio Moroder, I believe, has gone to live in the United States. Konstantinos has gone to live in the United States. Casablanca is emerging as the biggest commercial seller of records in the United States. And it's starting to make its money increasingly through the sound of Eurodisco. And we're in 1977. And disco's only really... I never quite know when disco properly comes through, but I don't think I don't even really believe that the word was properly in circulation even in 1974. It was starting to come through. It's only taken a couple of years, in a sense, for Eurodisco to suddenly become this significant force. And I'm not saying that because of, we've named a couple of records that Eurodisco has taken over yet. I don't think it has, but it's made serious inroads into this market, and it's also starting to sell itself to an American public as well as a European public. So there's quite a lot to be said about the racial implications of this for black disco. Black disco itself is struggling for recognition, partly because existing black music departments don't really like disco because they think it's a watering down or a dilution of other black music, rhythm and blues and soul in particular. And so having struggled to break through as African-American disco or black disco already, Eurodisco is kind of also coming in strongly as a main commercial force. So this raises it kind of raises quite a few questions, but we'll kind of return to these in the next episode.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tim. Yeah, that was great. That was really interesting. People will not be surprised. We're already thinking it might be 3 episodes on Eurodisco. And there's always more to talk about than we think when we get into these topics.
Three is a good number.
3 is a good number.
Know this.
It's the magic number.
Yeah. So,
and as ever, if you've enjoyed the show, please do tell people about it. If you haven't done before, and you can give it a rating on a platform, give it the 5 stars, which make the algorithm love us. If you have the means and can support us, please consider signing up to our Patreon. There's now a ton of extra content that keeps coming. Some really good stuff about all kinds of issues that I think will be interesting to everyone. And if you don't have the time or the means or the opportunity for any of that stuff, don't worry. Please keep listening. And thanks very much for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks, Tim. Thanks to producer Matt, as always. And you'll hear us next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.